I'm Rachel Martinez, and 3 months ago I was sitting in a crowded Washington, D.C. restaurant when my brother's boss walked over to our table. My brother Kevin had been bragging about his latest promotion at Goldman Sachs, while I sat quietly picking at my salad, still wearing the same black pantsuit I'd worn to 12 campaign events that week. When his boss approached, I expected the usual polite small talk. Instead, he extended his hand toward me and said, "Senator Martinez, it's an honor to finally meet you." The look on my brother's face was worth every sleepless night, every door slammed in my face, and every family dinner where I was told I was wasting my life chasing impossible dreams. But before I tell you about that moment, I need to take you back to where it all began, in a small house in Phoenix, Arizona, where my family was convinced I'd never amount to anything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up as the middle child in the Martinez household meant learning early that expectations weren't distributed equally. My older brother Kevin was the golden child, valedictorian, debate team captain, early admission to Stanford with a full scholarship. My younger sister Maria was the creative one, winning art contests and charming everyone with her natural charisma. Then there was me, Rachel, the one who asked too many questions and seemed to care more about other people's problems than her own future. Our father, Miguel Martinez, was a hard-working electrician who had immigrated from Mexico at 19 with nothing but determination and a tool belt. He'd built a small but successful electrical contracting business, Martinez Electric, employing 12 people in the Phoenix area. Mom, Carmen, managed the books and customer relations, turning what could have been just another small trade business into something that provided a comfortable middle-class life for our family. Both my parents believed deeply in the American dream, but their version of it was practical and straightforward. Get a good education, find a stable job with benefits, work hard, and build security for your family. Kevin fit this vision perfectly. By age 16, he was already talking about finance and business school, mapping out a path that would take him from Stanford to Wall Street. My parents would beam with pride whenever he explained compound interest or discussed market trends at the dinner table. Maria's artistic talents worried them initially, but when she started winning scholarship competitions and selling her paintings at local galleries while still in high school, they began to see her gifts as potentially lucrative. She could do graphic design for big companies, Dad would tell his friends, or maybe work for Disney. Artists make good money now. But me, I was the puzzle piece that didn't fit their carefully organized picture of success. It started in middle school when I became obsessed with a local news story about a family being evicted from their apartment due to a landlord's illegal rent increase. While my classmates were focused on teenage drama, I was researching tenant rights laws and writing letters to the city council. I convinced my 7th grade social studies teacher, Mrs. Henderson, to let me present my findings to the class. When I finished my presentation about housing inequality in Phoenix, she told me I had the makings of a future lawyer or politician. My parents' reaction to this praise was lukewarm at best. "Politics is a dirty business, Mija," Dad would say whenever I brought up current events. "Politicians make promises they can't keep, and honest people get eaten alive." Mom would nod in agreement, adding, "You're too sensitive for that world, Rachel. You care too much about people. They'll take advantage of that." By high school, my interest in civic engagement had only intensified. I volunteered for local campaigns, organized voter registration drives, and spent my weekends at community forums discussing everything from school funding to environmental policies. My junior year, I started a political awareness club that grew from 5 members to over 40 within a semester. I was passionate, driven, and completely convinced that good people could make a difference in government. My family saw it differently. At dinner one evening during my senior year, when I announced I'd been accepted to Arizona State University's political science program with a partial scholarship, the response was immediate and crushing. "Political science?" Kevin laughed, not unkindly, but with the casual dismissiveness of someone who'd never doubted his own path. "What are you going to do with that? Become a professional protester?" "There are many career paths in political science," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Public policy, campaign management, legislative work, maybe law school eventually. Maybe law school? Dad interrupted, setting down his fork with more force than necessary. Rachel, do you know how much law school costs? Do you know how competitive it is? Kevin is going to be making six figures right out of college. What's your plan for making a living while you're changing the world? The conversation that followed was one of those defining moments that stays with you forever. For 20 minutes, my family systematically dismantled every argument I made for pursuing political science. Kevin, fresh from his economics classes, explained how government jobs were economically inefficient and how the private sector was where real change happened. Maria, trying to be supportive but missing the mark, suggested I could always do politics as a hobby while pursuing something more practical. But it was my parents' response that cut the deepest. They'd seen too many young people, particularly in our community, chase dreams that led nowhere. They'd watched friends' children graduate with expensive degrees in fields that didn't pay the bills. Their skepticism wasn't born from malice but from genuine fear that I was setting myself up for disappointment and financial instability. You're a smart girl, Rachel, Mom said, her voice gentle but firm. But you're not being realistic. Politics is for people with connections, people with money. We're working-class people. We don't have the luxury of chasing dreams that might not work out. Look at the politicians on TV, Dad added. They're all rich, they all went to fancy schools, they all have family money. You think someone like us can compete with that? You're setting yourself up to be disappointed. The subtext was clear. I wasn't impressive enough, connected enough, or special enough to succeed in a field reserved for people unlike us. Their words weren't intended to be cruel, but they reflected a deep-seated belief that certain opportunities simply weren't meant for people from backgrounds like ours. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, their words echoing in my mind. For the first time, I seriously considered changing my major to something more practical. Business administration, perhaps, or accounting. Something that would make my family proud and provide the financial security they valued above all else. But something in me rebelled against that path. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was naivete, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were wrong. I'd seen the impact that dedicated public servants could have on their communities. I'd witnessed how local politicians could change lives through policy decisions. I'd experienced firsthand the satisfaction of organizing people around causes they cared about. More importantly, I'd started to understand something that my family, despite their love and good intentions, couldn't see. The very qualities they worried would make me unsuitable for politics. My empathy, my determination to fight for others, my refusal to accept unfairness, were actually strengths in the field I wanted to enter. The next morning, I called Arizona State and confirmed my enrollment in the political science program. I didn't tell my family about my decision until the day before orientation, and their reaction was exactly what I expected. Resigned disappointment mixed with worry about my future. "We love you, Mija," Mom said, hugging me goodbye. "But don't come crying to us when this doesn't work out the way you think it will." As I drove toward campus that August morning, I made a promise to myself. I would prove them wrong, not out of spite or anger, but because I genuinely believed that someone from our background could make a difference in politics. I would show them that caring too much wasn't a weakness, that asking too many questions was a strength, and that the American dream they'd worked so hard to achieve could be expanded beyond their practical definition of success. I had no idea how long that journey would take, how many times I would doubt myself, or how dramatically my family's perception of my choices would eventually change. All I knew was that I was driving towards something that felt like destiny, even if I was the only one who could see it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Arizona State University's campus sprawled across Tempe like a small city, and walking through it for the first time, I felt both exhilarated and overwhelmed. The political science department was housed in a modern building with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the palm trees and red-tiled roofs that defined the Arizona landscape. Professor Janet Hawthorne, my advisor, was a former state legislator who had left office to teach after serving 3 terms in the Arizona House of Representatives. "So you want to change the world," she said during our first meeting. reviewing my high school transcripts and essay about social justice. It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. Good. But understand that wanting to change the world and actually doing it are two very different things. The first is idealism. The second requires strategy, persistence, and a very thick skin. I thought I understood what she meant, but I was about to learn just how unprepared I was for the reality of pursuing political dreams without the safety net of family support or financial security. My partial scholarship covered tuition, but everything else, housing, meals, books, transportation, fell to me. While Kevin was enjoying fraternity life at Stanford with a generous allowance from our parents, I was working 25 hours a week at the campus bookstore and living in the cheapest dorm available. My roommate, Jessica Chen, was a pre-med student whose parents had immigrated from Taiwan. She understood the pressure of family expectations in a way that created an instant bond between us. My parents wanted me to be a doctor from the time I could walk, she told me one night as we shared instant ramen in our cramped room. What do your parents want you to be? Anything but a politician, I replied, and we both laughed, though mine felt hollow. The financial strain was constant and exhausting. While my classmates discussed internships in Washington, D.C. or study abroad programs, I was calculating whether I could afford to buy the required textbooks or if I'd have to rely on library copies for another semester. The political science program offered several prestigious unpaid internships with local representatives and campaign organizations, but I couldn't afford to work for free when every hour not spent in class needed to be earning money. This created a cruel irony. The very experiences that would have prepared me for a political career were inaccessible because I needed to work to stay in school. I watched classmates whose parents could support them gain valuable experience, working on campaigns and in government offices, building networks and resumes that would serve them for years to come. But I refused to give up. Instead, I found creative ways to gain political experience while meeting my financial obligations. I volunteered for phone banking in the evenings after my bookstore shifts, sometimes staying until midnight to help with voter outreach. I attended every free political event on campus, from candidate forums to policy debates, often arriving straight from work still wearing my name tag. My breakthrough came during my sophomore year when Professor Hawthorne recommended me for a work-study position with the Maricopa County Democratic Party. The pay was minimal, barely above minimum wage, but it was political work, and I threw myself into it with an enthusiasm that quickly caught the attention of the party's executive director, Robert Sullivan. "You're here before I arrive in the morning, and you're still here when I leave at night," he observed one Friday evening as I updated voter databases at my desk. "You realize this is just a part-time position, right?" "I know," I replied, not looking up from my computer screen. "But there's so much to learn, and every phone call, every voter contact, every piece of data matters. This is how democracy actually works, isn't it? One conversation, one vote, one person at a time." Robert studied me for a moment, then pulled up a chair. "Tell me about your family. Do they support your political interests?" The question caught me off guard, and I felt my cheeks flush. "They think I'm wasting my time," I admitted. "They want me to pursue something more stable. And what do you think?" "I think they're wrong," I said, finally meeting his eyes. "I think the reason so many people have lost faith in government is because we've let it become a game for the wealthy and well-connected. People like my family, working families, they deserve representatives who understand their struggles, who didn't grow up with trust funds and family connections." Robert nodded slowly. "You know what your problem is, Rachel?" My heart sank, expecting another lecture about being unrealistic. "Your problem is that you're right, but you don't yet understand how to be effective. Passion without strategy is just noise. You want to represent working families? Then you need to learn how to win elections, how to build coalitions, how to navigate the system well enough to change it." That conversation changed everything. Robert became my first real mentor in politics, teaching me that idealism without pragmatism was useless, but pragmatism without ideals was corrupting. He began assigning me increasingly complex projects, researching opposition candidates, organizing community forums, managing voter registration drives in underserved neighborhoods. The work was demanding, but it felt like coming alive. I discovered I had a natural talent for connecting with people from different backgrounds, for finding common ground between seemingly opposing viewpoints. I could talk to conservative small business owners about the importance of infrastructure investment, and progressive activists about the value of incremental change. Most importantly, I learned to listen before I spoke, to understand what people really cared about beneath their political rhetoric. My family remained skeptical. During winter break of my sophomore year, I returned home full of stories about voter turnout initiatives and candidate forums, only to be met with polite but obvious disinterest. Kevin was home from Stanford, with tales of internships at investment banks and networking events with alumni who worked at major corporations. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. "So what exactly is your plan after graduation?" Dad asked during Christmas dinner, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. "I'm considering several options," I replied carefully. "Robert thinks I could get hired by the state party after I graduate, or possibly work on a congressional campaign. There are also graduate school programs in public policy that could open doors to— How much do those jobs pay?" Kevin interrupted, not maliciously, but with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to worry about money. I hesitated. The truth was, entry-level political jobs paid terribly, often requiring people to work for free or for poverty wages while they gained experience. The system was designed in a way that excluded people who couldn't afford to work without pay, creating a political class dominated by those with family wealth. Starting salaries are modest, I admitted, but the experience is invaluable and there are opportunities for advancement. "Modest," Mom repeated, exchanging a look with Dad. "How modest?" "Campaign work might start around $22,000 a year," I said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. Kevin made $22,000 during his summer internship alone. "Mija," Dad said finally, his voice gentle but firm, "you're a junior in college. You're smart, you work hard, you could do anything you want. Why are you choosing something that will keep you struggling financially? We worked so hard so that you kids wouldn't have to worry about money the way we did. Because someone has to represent people like us," I replied, my voice stronger than I felt. "Someone has to fight for families who work 2 jobs and still can't afford health care, who see their kids' schools underfunded while wealthy districts get new facilities. If everyone with education and ability goes into finance or tech because that's where the money is, who's left to fight for everyone else?" "That's very noble," Maria said, and I could hear the but coming. "But you can't help anyone if you can't help yourself first. Maybe you could work in business for a few years, save some money, and then pursue politics later?" It was a reasonable suggestion that completely missed the point. Politics wasn't something you dabbled in after establishing financial security. It was a calling that required total commitment, starting from the bottom and working your way up through a system that was often hostile to outsiders. But I couldn't explain this to my family without sounding naive or stubborn. From their perspective, I was choosing poverty over prosperity, instability over security, all for abstract ideals that might never translate into concrete results. The rest of winter break was tense. My parents weren't cruel, but their disappointment was palpable. They'd worked so hard to give their children opportunities they'd never had, and here I was, seemingly throwing those opportunities away for a career path that offered neither financial security nor clear prospects for advancement. I returned to school in January more determined than ever to prove them wrong, but also more aware of the enormous challenges ahead. I couldn't count on family financial support, couldn't afford unpaid internships in Washington, couldn't network at expensive political events or join exclusive organizations that required membership fees. But I had something many of my classmates didn't: genuine motivation to fight for people like my family even if they couldn't see the value in that fight yet. I had Robert's mentorship, Professor Hawthorne's guidance, and a growing network of contacts within Arizona's political community who had begun to take notice of my work ethic and dedication. Most importantly, I had begun to understand that my outsider status wasn't just an obstacle to overcome. It was also a strength that could set me apart in a field too often dominated by insiders who'd never struggled to pay rent were worried about affording groceries. The question wasn't whether I belonged in politics despite my background. The question was whether politics was ready for someone like me. I was about to find out. Graduation day at Arizona State arrived with the typical May heat that made Phoenix feel like the surface of Mars. As I sat in the sweltering auditorium wearing my cap and gown, listening to the commencement speaker discuss limitless possibilities, I clutched a letter in my sweaty palm. It was a job offer from the Arizona Democratic Party for a position as regional field organizer, starting salary $28,000 per year. My family had come to watch me graduate, and seeing them in the audience filled me with conflicting emotions. Pride that I'd made it through college, anxiety about their reaction to my career plans, and a stubborn determination to prove that political work could be both meaningful and sustainable. After the ceremony, as we gathered for photos near the Political Science Building, Dad pulled me aside. "So, Misha, what's next? Any job prospects?" I handed him the letter. He read it carefully, his expression growing more concerned with each line. "28,000, he said quietly. "In Phoenix. Do you know what rent costs here now?" I did know. I'd been apartment hunting for weeks, trying to find something I could afford on my new salary. The best I could manage was a studio apartment in a questionable neighborhood, and even that would consume nearly half my paycheck. "It's a starting position," I said, echoing the words Robert Sullivan had used when he offered me the job. "There's room for advancement, and the experience will be invaluable." Mom joined us, having overheard the conversation. "Rachel, honey, we're proud of you for graduating. But this," she gestured at the letter, "this isn't sustainable. You can't build a life on $28,000. Kevin, fresh from his Stanford graduation and heading to Goldman Sachs, with a starting salary of $150,000 plus bonuses, tried to be supportive. "Maybe you could do this for a year or two, get some experience, then transition to corporate consulting or lobbying. Those jobs pay much better." "I don't want to lobby for corporations," I replied, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "I want to help elect people who will fight for working families." "But you'll be a working family making poverty wages," Maria pointed out, and I had to admit she had a point. The conversation continued over dinner at a nice restaurant Dad had chosen to celebrate my graduation. As my family debated the practical implications of my career choice, I felt increasingly isolated, as if I were speaking a different language. They saw my passion for politics as an expensive hobby I couldn't afford. I saw it as the most important work I could possibly do. 2 weeks later, I started my job as regional field organizer, responsible for voter outreach and campaign coordination across 3 counties in southern Arizona. My territory included some of the most conservative districts in the state, places where Democratic candidates typically lost by 30 points or more. My job was to find the few Democratic voters who existed in these areas and make sure they actually showed up to vote. The work was brutally difficult and often demoralizing. I spent my days driving between small towns with names like Bisbee, Wilcox, and Tombstone, trying to convince people to volunteer for candidates they'd never heard of running for offices they didn't understand. My car, a 10-year-old Honda Civic with over 200,000 miles, broke down regularly on the desert highways, leaving me stranded with nothing but cacti for company while I waited for roadside assistance I couldn't afford. My first major assignment was helping coordinate the campaign for Daniel Chen, a progressive lawyer running for state legislature in a district that hadn't elected a Democrat since 1994. Daniel was brilliant, passionate, and completely naive about retail politics. He wanted to focus on complex policy proposals, while I tried to explain that most voters made decisions based on much simpler factors. Did they trust the candidate? Did they feel heard? Did the candidate understand their daily struggles? "We need to talk about healthcare reform and education funding," Daniel would insist during our strategy meetings. "We need to talk about why Mrs. Gonzalez's property taxes went up while her grandson's school lost its music program," I would counter. Policy is important, but people vote for candidates who understand their lives. The campaign headquarters was a donated storefront in Tucson, with broken air conditioning and furniture that looked like it had survived several previous campaigns. I worked 16-hour days coordinating volunteers, organizing phone banks, and trying to stretch our microscopic budget far enough to compete with our opponent's well-funded operation. My personal life became non-existent. I lived on coffee, convenience store sandwiches, and whatever was served at campaign events. My studio apartment became a storage facility for campaign materials and a place to crash for a few hours between events. I was 22 years old, working my dream job, and absolutely miserable most of the time. The worst part was the constant reminder of how different my life was from my siblings. Kevin would call from New York with stories about client dinners at expensive restaurants and weekend trips to the Hamptons. Maria had landed a graphic design job at a trendy marketing firm in San Diego, making more money than I was while working normal hours and having an actual social life. During one particularly low moment, 3 months into the campaign, my car broke down again on Highway 90 between Benson and Sierra Vista. As I sat on the side of the road waiting for a tow truck I couldn't afford, watching the sun set over the desert mountains, I seriously considered calling my parents and asking for help finding a real job. My phone rang. It was Mrs. Elena Ramirez, a 70-year-old retired teacher from Douglas who had become one of our most dedicated volunteers. "Rachel, Mija, are you okay? You missed the phone bank tonight." I explained about the car trouble, trying to keep the frustration and exhaustion out of my voice. "Where are you? I'm coming to get you." "Mrs. Ramirez, it's almost 9 o'clock, and Douglas is an hour away." "So? You think I'm going to leave you stranded in the desert? Besides, we need to talk about the voter registration event this weekend." An hour later, Mrs. Ramirez arrived in her ancient pickup truck, refusing to let me pay for gas as we drove back to Tucson. During that drive, she told me stories about growing up in a family of migrant workers, about fighting for bilingual education programs, about watching her community be ignored by politicians who never bothered to visit unless they needed votes. "You know why I volunteer for this campaign?" she asked as we pulled into my apartment complex. "Because you believe in Daniel's platform?" She laughed. "I volunteer because of you, Mija. In 40 years of voting, you're the first political person who's ever asked me what I think, instead of telling me what I should think. You listen to people. That's rarer than you know." That conversation reminded me why I'd chosen this path despite its difficulties. Politics wasn't just about winning elections or advancing policy proposals. It was about creating connections between people and their government, about making democracy work for everyone instead of just the wealthy and well-connected. But the financial reality remained crushing. Election day approached, and despite our best efforts, Daniel lost by 18 points. It was a better showing than expected in such a conservative district, but still a clear defeat. The campaign dissolved overnight, leaving me unemployed just as my lease was up for renewal. I called Robert Sullivan, hoping he might have another position available. "I'm sorry, Rachel," he said. "Budget cuts mean we can't hire anyone new right now. Have you considered grad school? Or maybe working on federal campaigns? There might be opportunities in Washington." Washington opportunities required money I didn't have for moving expenses, professional wardrobes, and the ability to work for free or very low wages while building experience. It was the same catch-22 that had frustrated me in college. The best opportunities in politics were reserved for people who could afford to take them. That night, I called my parents for the first time in months. Dad answered on the second ring. "Rachel, how did the election go?" "We lost," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "And the campaign is over, so I'm looking for work again." The silence stretched uncomfortably before Mom picked up the extension. "Mija, are you okay? You sound exhausted." I was exhausted. More than exhausted. I was broke, professionally uncertain, and beginning to wonder if my family had been right all along about the impracticality of political careers. "Maybe," I said slowly, "maybe I should look into other options. Kevin mentioned something about consulting work." "You could always come home for a while," Dad offered gently. "Help out with the business, save some money, figure out your next step." The offer was tempting. Martinez Electric was thriving, and Dad had been talking about expanding into commercial projects that would require someone with organizational skills and education. I could make decent money, live rent-free for a while, and prove to my family that I wasn't completely impractical. But something in me rebelled against the idea of giving up so easily. Yes, the Daniel Chen campaign had failed, but we'd run a competitive race in an impossible district with almost no resources. Yes, I was broke and unemployed, But I'd gained invaluable experience and built relationships with people like Mrs. Ramirez who believed in the work I was doing. "Let me think about it," I told my parents. "I have a few other leads I want to pursue first." The leads were mostly imaginary, but I wasn't ready to admit defeat. Over the next 2 weeks, I applied for every political job I could find: campaign positions, nonprofit work, government internships, lobbying firms that claimed to represent public interest causes. Most never responded. Others sent polite rejection letters citing my lack of experience or inadequate qualifications. Just when I was beginning to seriously consider my father's offer, I received a call from Marcus Webb, campaign manager for Congresswoman Sarah Hutchinson, who was facing a surprisingly competitive re-election race in Arizona's 2nd Congressional District. "I've been asking around about young organizers with experience in rural areas," Marcus said. "Your name keeps coming up. Are you interested in doing field work for a congressional campaign?" The pay was barely better than my previous job, the hours would be even longer, and there was no guarantee of employment after Election Day. But it was another chance to prove myself in the political world I was determined to succeed in. "When do I start?" I asked. Congresswoman Sarah Hutchinson's campaign headquarters in Flagstaff buzzed with an energy I'd never experienced before. Unlike the cramped storefront operation I'd worked in for Daniel Chen, this was a professional political machine with actual resources, experienced staff, and polls showing a competitive race. For the first time in my political career, I felt like I was working on a campaign that might actually win. Marcus Webb, the campaign manager, was everything I wasn't: Ivy League educated, connected to national political networks, and comfortable navigating the world of big money fundraising and media strategy. But he'd hired me specifically because of my experience working in rural, conservative areas where most Democratic operatives feared to tread. "Your job," Marcus explained during my first day briefing, "is to squeeze every possible vote out of the smaller counties. Everyone else focuses on Flagstaff and the Native American communities, but there are Democrats hiding in those little ranch towns and mining communities. We need you to find them." My territory included Coconino, Navajo, and Apache counties, vast stretches of high desert, pine forests, and small communities scattered across landscapes that looked like movie sets for old westerns. The work was similar to what I'd done before, but with better resources and a candidate who actually had a chance of winning. Congresswoman Hutchinson was a former prosecutor who'd served 2 terms, building a reputation as someone who listened to constituents regardless of party affiliation. She was tough, pragmatic, and had a gift for explaining complex policy issues in language that resonated with ordinary voters. Working for her taught me lessons about political communication that no textbook could provide. "Never use insider language," she told me during one of our strategy sessions. "The moment you say stakeholders or deliverables or robust framework, you've lost half your audience. Talk like a human being, not like a Washington consultant." My breakthrough moment came during a town hall meeting in Show Low, a mountain community known for its conservative politics and skepticism of government. The meeting was supposed to focus on forest management and wildfire prevention, but the conversation quickly turned to healthcare costs when an elderly rancher named Bill Morrison stood up. "Congresswoman, my wife needs medication that costs $800 a month," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "We've been married 43 years, worked our ranch our whole lives, and now we're choosing between her medicine and keeping the lights on. This isn't the America I fought for in Vietnam." Before Congresswoman Hutchinson could respond, I found myself standing up. "Mr. Morrison, could you tell us more about your wife's condition? Sometimes there are programs available that people don't know about." What followed was a 20-minute conversation between Bill Morrison and various audience members about prescription drug costs, Medicare gaps, and the impossible choices facing rural seniors. Instead of abstract policy discussions, we heard real stories from real people about real problems. Congresswoman Hutchinson took notes throughout the discussion, then stood up. "This is exactly why I voted for the Medicare prescription drug negotiation bill last year. Washington politicians make these decisions in conference rooms, but they affect families like yours in ways they never understand. I want to connect you with my district office staff before you leave tonight." After the meeting, as people filed out, several approached me directly. "Are you going to be working on healthcare issues?" asked Mary Chen, a nurse from the local hospital. "Because we need someone in politics who actually listens to what's happening in our communities." That night, driving back to Flagstaff through the dark forest, I realized something had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't just implementing someone else's political strategy, I was helping shape it. The conversations I facilitated between constituents and their representative were creating genuine policy responses. Word of my effectiveness in rural outreach began spreading through Arizona's political circles. Other campaigns started asking Marcus if they could borrow me for specific events. Local newspaper reporters began including my quotes in their stories about rural political trends. I was becoming known as someone who could bridge the gap between urban Democratic politics and rural Arizona voters. The recognition was professionally satisfying, but it came with unexpected personal costs. My work schedule intensified as Election Day approached, often requiring me to be away from home for days at a time, sleeping in cheap motels and living on gas station coffee and fast food. My already minimal social life disappeared entirely. More challenging was the growing distance between my world and my family's understanding of it. When I called home to share news about successful voter registration drives or positive press coverage, their responses were polite but puzzled. My victories didn't translate into their definition of success. "That's nice, mija," Mom would say when I told her about organizing a successful healthcare forum. "But when do you think you'll be able to buy a house? Or start saving for retirement? Maria just got promoted again, and Kevin's bonus this year was more than you make in 2 years." The comparisons stung because they highlighted a truth I was trying to ignore. My political career was advancing, but my financial situation remained precarious. I was gaining respect within Democratic political circles while living paycheck to paycheck, unable to afford the basic markers of adult success that my siblings had achieved. 3 weeks before Election Day, everything changed. Congresswoman Hutchinson's opponent, a wealthy businessman named Richard Sterling, launched a series of attack ads that backfired spectacularly. One ad criticized Hutchinson for, quote, "wasting time listening to complaints from rural voters instead of focusing on real issues." The ad featured footage from the Show Low town hall, including my conversation with Bill Morrison about prescription drug costs. Within days, the ad became a rallying cry for Hutchinson's campaign. Rural voters who had been lukewarm about her candidacy suddenly saw her as someone who genuinely cared about their concerns. My name started appearing in newspaper articles about the campaign's rural strategy. Marcus pulled me aside the morning after the ad started running. "You realize you're about to become the most recognizable Democratic operative in rural Arizona, right? This could open a lot of doors for you." He was right. Over the next 2 weeks, I received calls from political consultants, nonprofit organizations, and even some lobbying firms interested in my rural outreach expertise. For the first time since starting my political career, I had options that included decent salaries and job security. Election night was held at a hotel ballroom in Flagstaff, filled with supporters, volunteers, and media. As returns came in showing Hutchinson winning by a larger margin than anyone had predicted, I found myself at the center of attention in a way that was both thrilling and overwhelming. "Rachel Martinez is the reason we won those rural counties," Hutchinson told a reporter from the Arizona Republic during her victory speech. "She understands that good politics means listening to people, not lecturing them." The quote appeared in newspapers across the state the next morning, along with a photo of me shaking hands with voters at a campaign event. Suddenly, my phone was ringing constantly with job offers, interview requests, and invitations to political events I'd previously only heard about. Among the calls was one from David Patterson, Chief of Staff for Senator Elizabeth Warren's office in Washington. "We've been following your work in Arizona," he said. "The senator is looking for someone to lead rural outreach efforts for a national initiative on economic inequality. Would you be interested in discussing the position?" The offer was everything I'd dreamed of. Working in Washington, decent salary, national political exposure, and the chance to work on issues I cared deeply about. It was also terrifying. Moving to D.C. would require resources I didn't have and would take me even further from my family's understanding of my career choices. That weekend, I drove home to Phoenix to discuss the opportunity with my family. The conversation took place over Sunday dinner, the same setting where so many previous discussions about my career had unfolded. Washington, D.C., Dad repeated when I explained the offer. That's a big step. What does it pay? $65,000 to start, with potential for advancement, I replied. It was more than double my current salary, though still modest by my family's standards. And what exactly would you be doing? Kevin asked, genuinely curious for the first time about my work. I explained the Rural Outreach Initiative, the opportunity to work on national policy, the potential for career advancement within Senator Warren's organization. As I talked, I could see my family's perception of my career beginning to shift slightly. It sounds like you're becoming an expert in something specific, Maria observed. Like you're not just working on random campaigns anymore. You have a specialty. She was right. Without fully realizing it, I developed expertise in an area that few Democratic operatives understood: how to communicate progressive values to conservative rural voters. It was a skill set that was increasingly valuable as the party struggled to compete outside urban areas. I'm proud of you, Mom said quietly, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. I don't understand everything you do, but I can see that you're good at it, and that people respect your work. It wasn't the full endorsement I'd been hoping for since college, but it represented a significant shift. For the first time, my family was beginning to see my political career as something more than an expensive hobby or youthful idealism. Dad cleared his throat. If you take this Washington job, does that mean you're done with Arizona politics? I don't think I'll ever be completely done with Arizona, I replied. But this could open doors to bigger opportunities. Maybe someday I could run for office myself. The words surprised me as soon as I said them. Running for office had always been a distant theoretical possibility, but sitting at my family's dinner table, having just received national recognition for my political work, it suddenly felt achievable. Like what kind of office? Kevin asked. State legislature, maybe. Or Congress, eventually. I paused, then added with a confidence I didn't entirely feel. Maybe even Senate someday. Lauren laughed, not unkindly. From the girl whose family said she'd never amount to anything to Senator Martinez. That would be something. As I drove back to Flagstaff that night, I thought about her words, Senator Martinez. It had a nice ring to it, though it still felt like a fantasy rather than a realistic goal. But for the first time in my political career, my family was beginning to see the path I was on as leading somewhere meaningful. The question was whether I was ready to take the next step, to leave Arizona and the life I'd built there for the unknown possibilities that Washington, D.C. might offer. It was a decision that would determine not just my career trajectory, but whether my family's growing respect for my work would continue to develop or remain forever conditional on conventional markers of success. The Hart Senate office building felt like a cathedral of democracy, with its soaring marble corridors and the constant hum of people making decisions that affected millions of lives. Walking through those halls for the first time as Senator Elizabeth Warren's Rural Outreach Coordinator, I carried a briefcase that cost more than my first month's rent in Phoenix and wore a suit I'd bought specifically for this job interview 6 months earlier. Moving to Washington had been the most terrifying and exhilarating decision of my life. The apartment hunt alone nearly broke my spirit. What passed for affordable housing in D.C. would have been considered luxury accommodations in Arizona. I ended up in a tiny studio in Adams Morgan, sharing a building with congressional interns, nonprofit workers, and other political hopefuls trying to make it in the nation's capital. My first week on the job was a masterclass in how national politics operated at a completely different level from state campaigns. Senator Warren's office was a precision machine, with staff members who spoke in acronyms I didn't recognize and referenced policy details with the casual familiarity I'd once reserved for discussing Arizona voting patterns. David Patterson, the chief of staff who had recruited me, gave me a reality check during our first official meeting. Your Arizona work was impressive, but this is different. You're not dealing with a few thousand rural voters anymore. We're talking about developing outreach strategies for rural communities across 15 states. The scale is massive, and the stakes are national. My initial assignment was analyzing why Democratic candidates consistently underperformed in rural areas across the Midwest and South. The data was sobering. In county after county, communities that had once been competitive for Democrats were now solidly Republican, often by margins that seemed insurmountable. But as I dove deeper into the research, patterns emerged that reminded me of my work in Arizona. Rural voters weren't rejecting Democratic policies as much as they were rejecting Democratic messengers who seemed out of touch with their daily realities. Healthcare, infrastructure, and economic opportunity were top concerns in rural focus groups, but Democratic candidates too often talked about these issues in abstract policy terms rather than concrete human impact. I spent my first month traveling to places like rural Iowa, small-town Ohio, and farming communities in North Carolina, conducting listening sessions similar to the ones that had worked so well in Arizona. The feedback was remarkably consistent. People felt ignored by politicians who only showed up during election seasons, and dismissed by a party that seemed to view rural voters as obstacles to overcome rather than constituents to serve. My breakthrough came during a visit to Youngstown, Ohio, where I organized a roundtable discussion about economic revitalization. Instead of inviting typical political stakeholders, I brought together a laid-off steelworker, a struggling family farmer, a small-town bank president, and a nurse practitioner dealing with the opioid crisis. Politicians keep talking about job training and economic development, said Mike Thompson, the former steelworker. But they never ask us what kinds of jobs we actually want, or what skills we already have. They assume we're just waiting around for someone to save us. That comment sparked a 2-hour conversation about economic dignity, community identity, and the gap between policy intentions and lived experience. I recorded the entire session and transcribed it that night in my hotel room, recognizing that these voices needed to be heard in Washington policy discussions. When I presented my findings to Senator Warren's policy team, the response exceeded my expectations. "This is exactly what we've been missing," said Jennifer Liu, the senator's economic policy director. "We've been designing rural economic policies from the outside in instead of the inside out." Senator Warren herself reviewed my report and requested a briefing. Meeting her in person was intimidating. Her reputation for thorough preparation and sharp questioning was legendary among staff. But when I walked into her office and began explaining what I'd learned from rural communities, her engagement was immediate and genuine. "Tell me about the bank president in Youngstown," she said, leaning forward in her chair. "What did he say about credit access for small businesses?" For the next hour, we discussed rural economic challenges, with the same intensity I'd once brought to analyzing Arizona voting patterns. Senator Warren asked detailed questions about everything from agricultural lending practices to healthcare provider shortages, taking notes in her precise handwriting. "I want you to expand this work," she said finally. "But I also want you to start thinking about how these insights could translate into actual legislation. Policy without politics is just academic exercise. Politics without policy is just theater. We need both." That conversation marked the beginning of the most intellectually stimulating period of my career. Over the next 18 months, I helped develop what became the Rural Economic Opportunity Act, a comprehensive bill addressing everything from broadband infrastructure to healthcare access in underserved communities. More importantly, I learned how to translate grassroots insights into legislative language that could actually become law. The work brought recognition from across the political spectrum. Republican senators' offices started calling for briefings on rural outreach strategies. National media outlets quoted my research and stories about Democratic electoral challenges. I was invited to speak at conferences, contribute to policy journals, and advise other campaigns struggling with rural voter engagement. But success in Washington came with unexpected personal costs that went beyond the expensive rent and professional pressure. The pace of life was relentless, with 12-hour days being considered normal and weekends often consumed by travel to speaking engagements or research trips. My Arizona friends felt increasingly distant, both geographically and experientially. Phone conversations with my family became strained, as I struggled to explain work that seemed abstract and important in ways they couldn't quite grasp. The isolation was particularly acute during holidays. While my siblings gathered with their families and friends, I found myself alone in D.C., where the majority of political professionals either went home to other states or attended networking events that felt more like work than relaxation. During one particularly lonely Thanksgiving, I called Mrs. Elena Ramirez in Douglas, Arizona, the elderly volunteer who had rescued me during my first campaign breakdown. "How are you adjusting to the big city, Mija?" she asked. "It's complicated," I admitted. "The work is incredible, but sometimes I feel like I'm losing touch with why I got into politics in the first place." "Are you still fighting for people like us?" she asked simply. "Yes," I replied without hesitation. "Then you're exactly where you need to be. Just don't forget where you came from." Her words reminded me that my growing influence in Washington was only valuable if it remained connected to the communities I'd started out serving. I began making regular trips back to Arizona, not for campaign work but to maintain relationships with people whose lives were affected by the policies I was helping develop. These trips also helped repair my relationship with my family. Seeing me quoted in national newspapers and invited to television interviews slowly changed their perception of my career. I was no longer the impractical daughter chasing unrealistic dreams. I was becoming a recognized expert in an important field. The shift was most apparent during Christmas dinner in my second year in Washington. Kevin, now a vice president at Goldman Sachs, asked detailed questions about my work on rural economic policy. Maria showed me news articles she'd found online that mentioned my research. Most surprisingly, Dad asked if I thought my experience could help him understand how government regulations affected small businesses like his. "I'm proud of you, Mija," he said as we cleaned up after dinner. "I didn't understand what you were trying to do before, but I can see now that you were right about politics. You're making a difference." The validation I'd been seeking for nearly a decade felt surreal now that it was finally happening. My family's respect meant everything to me, but I'd also learned to value my work regardless of their approval. As my third year in Washington began, Senator Warren called me into her office for what I assumed would be a routine check-in about the Rural Economic Opportunity Act, which was gaining bipartisan support in committee. Instead, she had a different kind of conversation in mind. "Rachel, you've exceeded every expectation I had when we hired you," she began. "Your work has influenced national Democratic strategy on rural outreach, and you've become one of the most respected voices on rural economic policy in the party." I thanked her, uncertain where the conversation was heading. "I'm telling you this because I want you to start thinking about your next step. You could continue working in Senate offices, or move to a think tank, or work on presidential campaigns. But I think you should also consider running for office yourself." The suggestion hit me like a physical shock. Running for office? "You understand rural voters better than almost any Democrat in the party. You know how to translate policy into language people can relate to. And you have credibility with communities that most Democratic candidates struggle to reach." She paused. "Arizona's junior Senate seat will be up in 2 years. Have you given any thought to running?" I hadn't, at least not seriously. Running for Senate seemed like something other people did. People with family wealth, extensive political networks, and decades of name recognition. I was still paying off student loans and renting a studio apartment. "I appreciate the confidence," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure I'm ready for something like that." "Nobody's ever ready," Senator Warren replied with a smile. "But readiness isn't the same as qualification. You're qualified, Rachel. The question is whether you're willing to take the risk." That night, I sat in my tiny apartment looking out at the D.C. skyline, trying to imagine myself as a candidate for the United States Senate. The idea was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. It would mean leaving the security of my current position, raising millions of dollars, and subjecting myself to the kind of public scrutiny I'd only observed from the sidelines. But it would also mean the opportunity to implement the policies I'd been developing, to represent the communities I'd been fighting for, and to prove definitively that someone from my background could succeed at the highest levels of American politics. For the first time since that conversation with my family after high school graduation, I found myself at a crossroads that would determine not just my career but my entire life trajectory. The difference was that now, instead of being dismissed as unrealistic, my ambitions were being encouraged by one of the most powerful women in American politics. The question wasn't whether I was qualified to run for Senate. The question was whether I was brave enough to try. The decision to run for Senate crystallized during an unexpected moment 6 months after my conversation with Senator Warren. I was back in Arizona for a research trip, sitting in a diner in Tucson with Carlos Mendoza, a veteran who'd lost his job at a copper mine and was struggling to access the healthcare benefits he'd earned through his military service. As he described navigating bureaucratic mazes while dealing with chronic pain from an injury sustained in Afghanistan, I felt the familiar frustration that had driven me into politics years earlier. "You know what the worst part is?" Carlos said, stirring sugar into his coffee with hands that shook slightly from nerve damage. "I've written letters to both senators, called their offices, even showed up at town halls. They listen, they nod, they say they'll look into it. But nothing changes. It's like they speak a different language than the rest of us." That night, alone in my hotel room, I realized that all my policy work and rural outreach expertise meant nothing if it didn't translate into actual representation for people like Carlos. I could continue writing reports and briefing other senators about rural economic challenges, or I could run for a seat where I'd have the power to actually vote on solutions. I called Senator Warren the next morning. "I've been thinking about our conversation," I said, "about running for Senate. And? I think I want to do it." The silence stretched for several seconds before she responded. "Are you sure? Because once you announce, there's no going back. Every decision you've ever made will be scrutinized, every relationship will be examined, and you'll be asking people to invest millions of dollars in your candidacy." "I'm sure," I replied, surprised by how confident I sounded. "Or at least, I'm sure enough to start exploring what it would take." What it took, I quickly learned, was more than I had imagined. Within a week of expressing serious interest, my phone was ringing constantly with calls from potential consultants, fundraisers, and political operatives who specialized in Senate races. The conversations were simultaneously encouraging and overwhelming. "Your profile is perfect for Arizona," said Margaret Foster, a Democratic campaign consultant who'd managed successful Senate races in 3 states. Young Latina with deep roots in rural outreach and national policy experience. You could energize Latino voters while competing for moderate Republicans who are tired of extremism. The math, however, was daunting. A competitive Senate race in Arizona would require raising at least $12 million, probably more. I would need to build a campaign organization from scratch, compete in a primary against potentially better-known candidates, and then face a general election against a well-funded Republican opponent. More personally challenging was the impact the decision would have on my family. Running for Senate would mean moving back to Arizona, giving up my stable job in Washington, and subjecting my entire family to public scrutiny they'd never asked for. I flew home to Phoenix over Labor Day weekend to have the conversation I'd been dreading. My parents were hosting a barbecue for Maria's birthday, and for the first time in years, all 3 of us kids were home simultaneously. Kevin had flown in from New York with his new wife, Sarah, and Maria was there with her boyfriend, Diego, a fellow graphic designer she'd been dating for 2 years. As we sat around the patio table after dinner, watching the desert sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, I cleared my throat nervously. "I have something I want to discuss with all of you," I began. "I'm thinking about running for Senate." The silence was immediate and complete. Kevin set down his beer bottle slowly. Maria's eyes widened. Mom and Dad exchanged one of those married couple looks that communicated volumes without words. "Senate," Dad repeated finally. "Like the United States Senate." "Yes." "In Arizona," Mom added, as if confirming she'd heard correctly. "Yes." Kevin leaned forward in his chair. "Rachel, that's a huge step. Are you sure you're ready for something like that?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself constantly. "I don't know if anyone's ever ready," I replied, echoing Senator Warren's words, "but I think I'm qualified, and I know I care about the issues that matter to Arizona families." Maria, always the most direct of my siblings, cut to the heart of the matter. "What made you decide to do this?" I told them about Carlos Mendoza, about the hundreds of conversations I'd had with people who felt disconnected from their government, about the policies I'd helped develop that were stuck in committee while people suffered from problems those policies could solve. I could continue working on the sidelines, I concluded, or I could run for a position where I'd have the power to actually vote on these issues. Dad was quiet for a long time, staring out at his carefully maintained backyard. Finally, he spoke. "Running for Senate. That's not just about you anymore. That affects all of us. Your opponents are going to look into our business, our finances, probably try to find anything they can use against you." It was true, and it was one of the aspects of running that worried me most. Political campaigns had become increasingly personal. with candidates' families often becoming targets for opposition research and attack ads. I understand that, I said. And if any of you are uncomfortable with the attention this might bring, I need to know now. I won't put this family through something you didn't sign up for. Mom reached across the table and took my hand. Misha, we've watched you work toward this your entire adult life. We didn't understand it at first, but we see now what you've built. If you think you can help people by running for Senate, then we'll support you. Kevin nodded slowly. It's going to be intense, but honestly, Rachel, you're probably more qualified than half the people already in the Senate. If you want to do this, I think you should. The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from campaign logistics to family privacy concerns. By the end of the evening, I had something I'd never expected when I first announced my interest in politics: my family's unanimous support for my Senate candidacy. 2 weeks later, I submitted my resignation to Senator Warren's office and moved back to Arizona to begin building a campaign. The transition was jarring, going from the structured environment of a Senate office to the chaos of starting a political campaign from scratch. Felt like jumping out of an airplane without knowing if my parachute would open. My first hire was Patricia "Patty" Coleman, a campaign manager who'd run successful races for governor and Congress in southwestern states. Patty was a force of nature, a former Marine who approached political strategy with military precision and a work ethic that made my previous jobs look leisurely. Your biggest advantage, Patty told me during our first strategy session in a donated office space in Central Phoenix, is that you're not what people expect from a Democratic Senate candidate. You're not from money, you're not a career politician, and you understand parts of this state that most Democrats write off as hopeless. Our campaign strategy was built around that authenticity. Instead of the typical announcement tour hitting major cities and friendly venues, we decided to launch the campaign with a week-long listening tour through rural Arizona, visiting the kinds of communities I'd been working with for years. The announcement itself took place not in Phoenix or Tucson, but in Wilcox, a small farming community in southeastern Arizona, where I'd done voter outreach during my first campaign job. Standing in the town square on a crisp October morning, surrounded by ranchers, retirees, and working families, I officially declared my candidacy for the United States Senate. I'm running for Senate because I believe government should work for everyone, not just the wealthy and well-connected, I said to the crowd of about 200 people. I've spent my career listening to communities like this one, learning about the challenges facing working families, and developing policies to address those challenges. Now I want the opportunity to fight for those policies in the Senate. The speech was intentionally brief and focused on themes rather than detailed policy proposals. But what mattered more than the words was the setting and the audience. Most Democratic Senate candidates announced their campaigns in hotel ballrooms, surrounded by party activists and major donors. I was announcing mine in a small town square, surrounded by the kinds of voters Democrats needed to win back. The media coverage was extensive and largely positive. Martinez brings rural focus to Senate race, read the headline in the Arizona Republic. Democratic candidate launches campaign in Trump country, reported the Phoenix New-Times. National political reporters picked up the story, noting the unusual strategy of beginning a Senate campaign in conservative rural areas. But the real validation came from the people who attended the announcement. After my speech, I spent 2 hours talking with voters about everything from water rights to healthcare costs. These weren't staged conversations with friendly supporters. They were genuine discussions with people who had real concerns about real problems. You know, I've never voted for a Democrat in my life, said Frank Wheeler, a retired rancher who'd driven over from Benson to hear my speech. But you're talking about things that actually matter to people like me. Most politicians just tell us what they think we want to hear. That comment encapsulated what we were trying to achieve with the campaign. Instead of writing off conservative voters or pandering to them with empty rhetoric, we were engaging them with genuine policy discussions about issues that affected their daily lives. The listening tour continued for the rest of the week, with stops in Bisbee, Douglas, Sierra Vista, and Tombstone. At each event, the crowds grew larger and the conversations more substantive. Local media followed the tour, creating a narrative about a different kind of Democratic candidate who was willing to compete for votes in traditionally Republican areas. By the time we returned to Phoenix at the end of the week, our fundraising numbers had exceeded all expectations. Small-dollar donations were pouring in from across Arizona and beyond, often accompanied by notes from people who said they'd never contributed to a political campaign before, but were inspired by our message of inclusive representation. "This is unprecedented," Patty told me as we reviewed the week's results. "Most campaigns struggle to raise money in the first month. You've raised almost $250,000 in 5 days, mostly from first-time donors." The momentum was intoxicating, but I knew it was just the beginning. Announcing a campaign was easy compared to actually running one. Over the next 18 months, I would need to raise millions more dollars, win a competitive primary, and then defeat a Republican opponent who would have unlimited resources and a political machine built over decades. But for the first time since I'd decided to run, I felt genuinely confident that we could win. Not because the path would be easy, but because we were building something different. A campaign that reflected the diversity and values of modern Arizona, while respecting the concerns of voters who had felt left behind by both parties. As I drove home that night through the desert landscape I'd grown up in, I thought about how far I'd traveled from that family dinner where my parents had dismissed my political ambitions as unrealistic. Now I was a serious candidate for the United States Senate, with a growing campaign organization and a message that was resonating with voters across the political spectrum. The girl who'd been told she'd never amount to anything was now asking Arizona voters to make her their voice in Washington. And for the first time, that outcome seemed not just possible, but probable. The honeymoon period of positive media coverage and enthusiastic crowds lasted exactly 6 weeks. That's when Congressman Michael Torres announced his candidacy for the same Senate seat. And suddenly, I was no longer the inspiring newcomer, but the underdog challenger to an established politician with name recognition, endorsements, and a war chest that made my fundraising look like pocket change. Torres had represented Arizona's 7th congressional district for 8 years, building a reputation as a reliable progressive vote and a skilled fundraiser. More importantly for primary politics, he had the backing of the state Democratic establishment, labor unions, and several national organizations that had been waiting for him to run statewide. "This changes everything," Patty told me during our emergency strategy meeting the morning after Torres announced. "We're no longer running against the Republicans. We're running against our own party's preferred candidate. That's a much harder fight." The shift in dynamics was immediate and brutal. Donors who had seemed enthusiastic about my candidacy suddenly became non-committal, explaining that they needed to, quote, "see how the primary develops before making commitments." Endorsements, I'd been told, were put on hold pending Torres's entry into the race. Even some staff members I'd been recruiting chose to join his campaign instead. Most painfully, the narrative about my candidacy changed overnight. Where political reporters had initially written stories about my fresh perspective and grassroots appeal, they now framed the race as an establishment candidate versus an inexperienced outsider. The David versus Goliath comparison was flattering in theory but devastating in practice when Goliath had better name recognition and more money. The first major test came at the state Democratic Party's winter convention in Flagstaff, where both Torres and I were scheduled to speak to the party activists, who would provide crucial volunteer support and small-dollar donations. Walking into the convention center, I could immediately sense that the energy in the room favored my opponent. Torres spoke first, delivering a polished speech that hit all the right notes for a Democratic primary audience. Healthcare as a human right, climate change as an existential threat, immigration reform as a moral imperative. The applause was enthusiastic and sustained. When he finished, party officials and activists surrounded him, eager to shake hands and pledge support. My speech was scheduled for the afternoon, after lunch when energy typically flagged. As I waited backstage, listening to the subdued crowd noise, I questioned every decision that had brought me to this moment. Maybe my family had been right initially. Maybe politics was for people with connections and resources I simply didn't have. But when I walked onto the stage and saw familiar faces in the audience, Mrs. Elena Ramirez had driven up from Douglas. Several veterans from my rural listening tour were scattered throughout the crowd. Young activists I'd worked with during my time in Washington were cheering from the back. I remembered why I was running. Instead of delivering the carefully crafted speech my consultants had prepared, I spoke from the heart about the people I'd met during my years of political work. I talked about Carlos Mendoza struggling with Veterans Affairs bureaucracy, about Frank Wheeler questioning whether anyone in government understood rural communities, about the steelworker in Youngstown who just wanted politicians to ask what he thought instead of telling him what to think. "We can win this seat," I said, looking directly at the audience instead of reading from my notes. "But not by running the same kind of campaign that's been losing rural voters and working families across this country. We win by showing up in places other Democrats have written off, by listening to people who feel ignored, and by proving that our party represents everyone, not just the people who already agree with us." The response was different from Torres's reception. Less polished applause, but more sustained energy. People didn't just clap. They stood up, they nodded, they looked energized in a way that suggested genuine connection rather than routine political enthusiasm. After my speech, the conversations were more substantive than typical convention networking. "You reminded me why I got into politics," said Amy Rodriguez, a young teacher from Tucson. "Torres sounds like every other politician. You sound like someone who actually cares about changing things." But the real breakthrough came 3 months later during our first televised debate. The setting was Arizona PBS Studios in Phoenix, with a format that allowed for extended policy discussions rather than quick soundbites. I had spent weeks preparing with mock debates and policy briefings, knowing that this would be my first opportunity to reach voters across the entire state simultaneously. Torres arrived with a larger entourage and more polished presentation materials. During the pre-debate preparation time, his team exuded the confidence of a frontrunner facing a nuisance challenger. My team, by contrast, was focused and nervous, knowing we needed a game-changing performance to shift the race's trajectory. The first half of the debate covered predictable Democratic primary topics: healthcare policy, climate change, immigration reform. Torres demonstrated his command of legislative details and federal budget implications. I focused on connecting policies to real people's experiences, drawing on stories from my rural outreach work and Washington policy development. The turning point came during a question about rural economic development. The moderator asked how we would address the economic challenges facing Arizona's small towns and agricultural communities. Torres gave a textbook answer about federal infrastructure investment and agricultural subsidies, accurate but generic. When my turn came, I talked about specific communities I'd visited during my campaign, specific problems I'd encountered, and specific solutions that went beyond traditional Democratic talking points. The federal government has been trying to save rural communities for decades with one-size-fits-all programs designed in Washington, I said. But you can't revitalize Wilcox with the same approach you'd use in Tucson. Rural communities need representatives who understand their unique challenges, because they've actually spent time there, not just during campaign season, but year-round, listening and learning. Torres's response revealed the gap between us. "Well, I think Rachel is oversimplifying the complexity of federal rural development policy." The exchange crystallized the choice voters faced. Torres represented competence and experience within existing systems. I represented a different approach based on direct engagement with communities that felt left behind by those systems. The post-debate coverage was overwhelmingly positive for my performance. "Martinez shows command of rural issues," read the Arizona Republic headline. "Challenger outshines frontrunner in policy debate," reported Phoenix New-Times. More importantly, our internal polling showed a significant shift in voter perceptions, with my favorability ratings jumping among both Democratic primary voters and general election swing voters. But the real validation came from unexpected sources. Over the following weeks, I received calls from Democratic officials who had previously been neutral or leaning toward Torres. County party chairs from rural areas began endorsing my candidacy. Labor leaders whose unions had initially backed Torres started questioning whether he truly understood working-class concerns outside urban areas. The momentum shift was most apparent during my visit to Yuma, a border community where agricultural workers and military families represented core Democratic constituencies. What was supposed to be a small roundtable discussion with local leaders turned into a packed community forum with over 300 attendees. Finally, someone who talks about border issues like they understand what it's actually like to live here, said Maria Santos, a local school board member whose family had been in Yuma for 3 generations. Torres votes the right way in Congress. But Martinez talks like someone who's actually listened to border communities, instead of just reading about us in reports. The comment encapsulated the shift that was happening across Arizona's Democratic primary. Voters were beginning to see the choice not as experience versus inexperience, but as insider knowledge versus authentic connection. Torres knew how to navigate Washington, but I knew how to connect with the communities that Democrats needed to win back. The financial dynamics of the race began changing as well. While Torres still had more money from traditional sources, my small-dollar fundraising accelerated dramatically after the debate. We started receiving significant donations from people who had never contributed to political campaigns before, often accompanied by personal notes about why my message resonated with them. I've been a Democrat my whole life, but I haven't felt excited about a candidate in years, wrote Janet Mitchell, a retiree from Prescott who included a $50 check with her note. You remind me of why I believed in politics when I was young. By spring, the race had tightened considerably. Torres still led in most polls, but the margins were shrinking, and his favorability ratings were declining as voters learned more about both candidates. More importantly, our campaign had developed the kind of grassroots energy that translated into volunteer hours, voter contacts, and turnout operations that could overcome fundraising disadvantages. The final 2 months of the primary campaign became a test of which approach Arizona Democrats preferred: the establishment candidate with traditional qualifications, or the outsider with authentic connections to neglected communities. Every debate, every endorsement, and every fundraising report was analyzed for signs of which direction the race was moving. During this period, my family's role in the campaign became unexpectedly important. Dad started appearing at events, talking to other small business owners about regulatory issues and economic development. Mom worked phone banks, connecting with voters in Spanish and English about family concerns and community priorities. Even Kevin took vacation time from Goldman Sachs to help with fundraising calls, using his financial industry contacts to reach potential donors who appreciated his practical assessment of my policy proposals. I've seen Rachel work for 15 years, Kevin told a group of young professionals in Phoenix. She's the most dedicated person I know, and she understands economics better than most politicians understand anything. If you want someone in the Senate who will actually read the bills and understand their implications, she's your candidate. The family support meant more to me than any professional endorsement, but it also represented something larger about my campaign. We weren't just asking voters to choose a candidate. We were asking them to believe that someone from a working-class background could represent their interests as effectively as someone from traditional political networks. 3 weeks before the primary, our internal polling showed the race within the margin of error. Torres still had institutional advantages, but momentum was clearly on our side. The question was whether we had enough time and resources to complete the shift in voter sentiment that had been building since the first debate. As I looked toward primary election day, I felt the same mixture of confidence and anxiety that had defined my entire political career. We had built something remarkable, a campaign that connected with voters across traditional dividing lines and offered a new model for democratic politics in competitive states. The only question remaining was whether Arizona's Democratic primary voters were ready to take a chance on that new model, or whether they would stick with the safer choice of an established politician with conventional qualifications. In 3 weeks, we would have our answer. Primary election night felt like the longest 18 hours of my life. Our campaign headquarters in Phoenix buzzed with nervous energy as volunteers made last-minute get-out-the-vote calls, while early returns trickled in from across Arizona. The initial numbers showed exactly what we'd expected. Torres performing strongly in urban areas where his name recognition was highest, while I was winning decisively in the rural counties that most political observers had written off as irrelevant to a Democratic primary. Patty stood beside me at a computer terminal, refreshing election results every few minutes. Maricopa County is going to decide this, she said, pointing to the precinct map showing Phoenix and its suburbs. If we can keep it close in the city and win big everywhere else, we've got a shot. By 10 p.m., the race was still too close to call, but patterns were emerging that defied conventional political wisdom. I was winning not just in rural areas but in working-class suburbs, among Latino voters who connected with my family's immigrant story, and among younger Democrats who were drawn to my outsider status. Torres was winning among party activists and higher-income voters, but by smaller margins than his campaign had anticipated. The breakthrough moment came at 11:47 p.m. when Pima County's final precincts reported. I had won Tucson and its surrounding areas by a decisive margin, capturing both the university vote and the military families around Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. Combined with my rural strength, it was enough to overcome Torres's advantages in Phoenix. At 12:23 a.m., Torres called to concede. "You ran a hell of a campaign," he said, his voice carrying genuine respect despite the disappointment. "Arizona Democrats made their choice, and I'll do everything I can to help you win in November." The victory celebration at campaign headquarters was unlike anything I'd experienced. These weren't just political professionals celebrating a tactical win. They were people who had invested months of their lives in proving that a different kind of politics was possible. Mrs. Ramirez, now 72, had driven from Douglas to be there. Frank Wheeler, the rancher who'd attended my campaign launch despite never having voted Democratic, stood in the corner wearing a Martinez campaign sticker. But the real emotional moment came when my family arrived. Dad, who had taken the week off from his electrical business to help with campaign logistics, pulled me into a bear hug with tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand," he whispered. "You were right about this path. You were right about everything." Mom was more direct. "Senator Martinez has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?" The general election campaign that followed was even more intense than the primary. My Republican opponent, State Senator Brad Richardson, was a well-funded conservative with strong support in Arizona's growing suburban communities. Unlike the primary, where policy differences were subtle, the general election offered voters a clear choice between progressive and conservative visions for Arizona's future. Richardson tried to paint me as too liberal for Arizona, focusing on my work with Senator Warren and my support for progressive economic policies. Our campaign countered by emphasizing my deep Arizona roots and my ability to work with voters across party lines. The rural relationships I'd built during years of political work became crucial assets, providing credibility with independent voters who might otherwise be skeptical of a Democratic candidate. The final 2 weeks of the campaign were a blur of debates, rallies, and media appearances. National Democratic leaders campaigned with me, recognizing that Arizona could be crucial for maintaining Senate control. But the endorsement that meant the most came from an unexpected source. Frank Wheeler, the retired rancher who had become an unlikely symbol of my ability to reach across traditional political divides. "I still don't agree with Rachel on everything," he said at a rally in Tucson. "But she's the first politician who's ever asked me what I think instead of telling me what I should think. That's the kind of person we need in Washington." Election night arrived with polls showing a race within the margin of error. This time, our election watch party was at a hotel ballroom in Phoenix, filled with supporters, media, and family members who had traveled from across the country to witness what might be a historic victory. The returns came in faster than during the primary, and by 9 p.m. it was clear that the race would be decided by a narrow margin. Richardson performed strongly in conservative areas, but I was winning decisively among Latino voters, doing better than expected in suburban areas, and maintaining the rural coalition I'd built during the primary. At 10:45 p.m., with 87% of precincts reporting, the Associated Press called the race. I had won by 2.8 percentage points, a decisive margin in what everyone had expected to be a razor-thin contest. The victory speech that night was one of the most emotional moments of my life. Standing on the stage, looking out at a crowd that included family members, longtime supporters, and new faces who had joined our movement during the campaign, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 12 years ago, I began, my family told me I'd never amount to anything if I pursued a career in politics. Tonight, you've elected me to represent Arizona in the United States Senate. But the moment that gave the story its ultimate meaning happened 3 months later, during my first week as senator-elect in Washington. I was attending a reception for newly elected members of Congress when I noticed a familiar face across the room, my brother Kevin, who was in D.C. for a Goldman Sachs client meeting. I made my way through the crowd to where Kevin was standing with several other financial industry executives, including his boss, Managing Director Thomas Chen. As I approached, I could see Kevin's pride mixed with amazement at finding himself at a congressional reception because his sister was now a U.S. Senator. "Thomas," Kevin said as I joined their conversation, I'd like you to meet my sister." Thomas Chen extended his hand, with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to meeting politicians. But when Kevin completed the introduction, his expression changed to genuine surprise and respect. "Senator Martinez," he said, his handshake becoming more firm, his attention more focused. "It's an honor to finally meet you. I've been following your work on rural economic development. Goldman Sachs would love to discuss how we might support some of your infrastructure initiatives." The moment was everything I had worked toward for 15 years, not because of the Wall Street executive's attention, but because of what I saw in Kevin's face. My younger brother, who had once questioned whether political science was a real career path, was now introducing me with unmistakable pride to his colleagues as Senator Martinez. Later that evening, Kevin and I had dinner at a quiet restaurant near Capitol Hill. "You know what the craziest part is?" he said over dessert. "I used to think you were the impractical one in the family. Now I realize you were the only one of us who knew exactly what she wanted to do with her life. It wasn't always clear," I admitted. "There were plenty of times when I wondered if you and Maria and Mom and Dad were right about choosing a more stable path. But you didn't give up," Kevin said. "Even when we couldn't see what you were building, you kept building it anyway. That takes a kind of courage I'm not sure I have." As I walked back to my hotel that night through the streets of Washington, D.C., past the Capitol building where I would soon be sworn in as Arizona's junior senator, I thought about the circular journey that had brought me back to where my political career began. I had started as a young woman asking too many questions about why things were the way they were. Now I would have a vote on changing some of those things. Boss Island? The family that once told me I'd never amount to anything now introduced me as Senator Martinez. The rural communities that had been written off by Democratic strategists had provided the margin of victory in my election. The outsider perspective that had been seen as a liability in my early career had become the foundation of a successful political movement. But more than any title or achievement, what mattered was that the work continued. There were still veterans like Carlos Mendoza navigating bureaucratic mazes, still ranchers like Frank Wheeler wondering if anyone in government understood their concerns, still families across Arizona struggling with healthcare costs and economic uncertainty. The difference was that now, instead of writing reports about their problems or organizing listening sessions about their concerns, I would have the power to vote on solutions. The girl who was told she'd never amount to anything was now Senator Martinez, with 6 years to prove that good representation and authentic leadership could make a real difference in people's lives. That, ultimately, was what amounting to something really meant. Not the recognition or the title, but the opportunity to serve the communities that had shaped me, and to fight for the values that had driven me into politics in the first place. The rest was just the beginning of a new chapter in the work I'd been called to do since that first family dinner when I announced my intention to study political science. The skeptics had become believers, the outsider had become a senator, and the real work of governing had just begun. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.